で、私の方からですね、冒頭にご案内しました通り、今日は、統計に関するご講演ということで、せっかくですので、本学にありますですね、毛抜き型の太刀、これについて資料を入れてあります。パワーポイントはありません。そしてここで話させていただきますけれども、絵が並んでるやつですね。今回この先週金曜日に先生方の詳細な講演の内容が私の方に届きましたので、まさに付け焼き場、刀剣の、ね、日本語が多いですけど、付け焼き場で作った資料がこれでございます。で、ざっくりですね、先ほどフライ先生のパワーポイントの中にもありましたけれども、日本の、刀、腕刀になっていく過程、そのプロセスというのが非常に複雑だというような話がありました。それを少し丁寧に作ったのがこの資料ですね。これを見ていただきますと、一番最初にですね、旧石器の槍から出てます。これは武器としては飛ぶ道具ですのでね、少しニュアンスが違いますけれども、弥生時代に入ってくる、縄文時代の末期、1ページ目の3つ目ですね、石でできた剣がありますけれども、これは佐賀県の生岳というところから出てる朝鮮半島から入ってきた剣なんですね。これは実践というよりもそういう精神的なところに重きを置いた道具ということになります。で、紀元前後から入ってきたのがですね、右から2つ目、3つ目、この銅剣、銅矛というやつですね、こういった青銅器が入ってきて、これも実践の道具というよりも身体的な要素が強いものです。そして後発して入ってくるのが右端の鉄剣なんですね。こういったものがまず入ってくる。つまり刀というのは少し遅れて入ってくるんですね。で、なのに弥生人はですね、真ん中にあるような石の槍を作ってるんですね。これもまた近畿地方に特徴的に分布する。これで20センチぐらいある大きな長いものなんですね。これはどういうものなのかというのははっきり私にはわからないです。縄文時代のアイデンティティがそこに、現れたのかもしれません。2ページ目をめくっていただきますと、蘇関刀太刀から装飾太刀というふうになっております。丸っこい簡素なですね、使うところに丸いのがついて、これ実は中国起源なんですね。これが朝鮮半島に伝わって3世紀頃に日本に入ってくるんですね。これが刀の原型となっていくわけです。そしてその下のところにいろいろ柄の先端に装飾的な文様といいますかね、飾りがついているものがあります。これは朝鮮半島から伝わってきて、同時に日本でもこのような刀が発達していくんですね。模造して発達していくというですね、こういう石群が出てくるわけです。で、4世紀の終わり頃になると柄のところをですね、木製で作った木製塚頭というものが、これが日本列島のオリジナルデザインとして完成するというですね、こんな流れになるんですね。つまり古い刀っていうのは身がまっすぐで先端が少し鋭角に尖ったような形になるんですね。そして3ページをめくっていただくと、今度は砲刀太刀、系統太刀という、この上の2本ですね、これはなかなかその系譜というものがはっきりわからないんですけど、日本の中で、果たしていった装飾だと思われます。そしてその下がですね、これが明治天皇の配当となっておりますけれども、今宮内庁で預かられているものですね。これは水流剣というですね、直刀、奈良時代のものなんですね。まっすぐでかます切っ先といって切っ先が鋭角的に尖るやつですね。でその下の2本、黒漆の太刀、蘇早の太刀というのがありますけれども、これは実はですね、8世紀の終わりに征夷大将軍になった坂上の田村丸の配当なんですね。坂上の田村丸はですね、801年に4万の軍勢を率いて江戸地に向かいます。そして、勝利をしてですね、帰ってくるわけですね。その行く前に戦勝祈願をしたのが播磨の国の清水寺と京都の鞍馬寺、ここに戦勝祈願をして向かうんです。そして4万の大軍で戦勝して帰ってきて、そして奉納したのがこの3本なんですね。上が、黒塗りの太刀は鞍馬寺、そして蘇早の太刀、そして蘇早の太刀、その下の剣状のものですね、諸刃のものですけども、この2本を兵庫の清水寺、播磨の清水寺に収めてるんですね。それよく見ますとですね、蘇早の太刀っていうのはちょっと反りが出てますね。反りが出てます。 そしてその上の黒漆の太刀、黒漆の太刀っていうのはですね、要するに研ぎの地の部分、これは、その研ぎのところが広くなってるんですよ。これはまあ日本刀のそのしのぎにつながるですね、しのぎ作りにつながる、そういう作りになっているというですね、研がれた面が広くなっている。だんだんこう日本刀化しているっていうのが分かります。そして、そのソハヤの太刀の下の一番下のところですね、これが小ガラス丸といってですね、10世紀から11世紀頃に、これは平の貞盛が持っておりましてですね、これが伊勢の貞武ってですね、その京都の国学者ですね、その家に伝わって、そしてなぜか対馬の宗師のところに売られるんですね。そして宗師から明治天皇に奉られてですね、そして現在宮内庁のものになっているという非常に古い形。これはまさにその坂の上の田村麻呂が奉納した形を、ほぼ踏襲するような形で腕刀化しているというものなんですね。なぜ、こういうね形になっていったのかというのが次のページなんです。ちょっとややこしいんですけども、先ほどのフライデー先生の話、パワーポイントにも出ておりましたけれども、わらみでこう宝刀、友金と言います。友金塚刀、そして毛抜き型の太刀となるんですね。このわらびれ刀っていうのは名称はですね、さわらび、つまりわらびの新芽が出てる、そういうイメージで後で、明治時代に付けられた名称ですけども、こういった形、実はこの起源はですね、長野県、群馬県、そして茨城県あたりの北関東、中部あたりにあるんです。それが江戸地の方に、東北地方に波及して発達するんですね。ですから7世紀に発生して、7世紀の終わりには東北一円に圧倒的に多く分布する刀なんです。だから東北の江戸の人たちが非常に好んだ形なんです。それが、上から4ページ目の上から3つ目の宝刀友金刀っていうですね、両者共通するのはですね、これは柄がつかないんです。つまり柄の鉄人のところに直接紐を巻いて使うんですね。そういう使い方をするものなんです。それが、毛抜き型の太刀という形にですね、変わっていくんですね。それがちょうど上から4つ目、國學院大学にあるのがこの太刀なんですね。ですから後でよく見ていただければと思います。それがですね、この形っていうのは実は室町時代まで続くんです。毛抜き型の太刀の形が。ですからこれはずっと続くんですね。で途中3ページ目のですね、こういう日本古来のですね、朝鮮半島から伝わってきたこの平作りの刀のですね、形にこう要するにそれが移されていくんですね。そのプロセスが非常に複雑なんですけども、私が思うにというか、あまりその本には書いてないんですけども、実は征夷大将軍の田村麻呂がですね、戦争に勝って、そして捕虜を連れてくるんですね。その中には鍛冶がいたんですね。だから不習鍛冶と言います。不習鍛冶が都に連れてこられて刀を打った、そういう事実があるんですね。ですからこの練習じゃない彼らが好んだこの毛抜き型の太刀のフォームがですね、平作りの刀に移されていったのが小ガラス丸とか後に続く5ページ目に出てきている腕刀、これが今回の京刀展でも非常に有名になりましたですね、三条宗近、非常に古い刀だということで、現在、その宗近の刀を評価するですね、図録が最も新しいものが脅迫の図録なんですけども、これは12世紀になっております。ところが平成15年の図録を見るとですね、10世紀となっているんですね。研究がどうもよくわからないというですね、200年の差があっていかがなものだと思うんですけども、やっぱりこの辺りその直刀とですね、3ページから3ページと5ページを開いていただくとですね、要するに3ページの一番下と5ページの一番上の腕刀化した日本刀になっていく、その間の刀っていうのがあるはずなんですね。それはあまり図録なんかにも出てなかったんですけれども、例えば瀬戸内に大山積神社というのがあります。そこにはですね、小太刀というものが奉納されておりまして、まさにかます切っ先で、そして腕刀化しているんですね。おそらくその間を埋めるような資料も刀もあるんですね。ですからそういう東北の系統の刀と、そして都で作られた刀が融合した形でこの日本刀の腕刀につながっていくのではないかということなんですね。そんな私の前も言ってる、これは正しいかどうかは分かりませんけれども、そんな流れがキーマンは坂上の田村麻呂ではなかろうかと思われます。 そして、資料の6番目、それから先ほど先生たちがお話になったですね、中世以降刀剣の制作っていうものは5仮面という、これは江戸時代に、そういうふうに言われましたけれども、そういう大和、山城、備前、そして宗州、美濃というですね、この5つの地域を中心とした作刀が、始まります。そして、始まるというかずっと続いているんですけど、美濃園の場合は信長秀吉の時代ですのでね、少し後発になりますけれども、そういったところから近世になりますと、各大名がお抱えの刀工を作ってですね、日本中で刀が作られると、こんな流れになるわけですね。そういった参考資料とですね、そして、一番後ろにはですね、この前のこれもですね、兵庫県の工学物館で図録にいい図録があったので、これを拝借して載せておりますけれども、いわゆる名所が載っております。参考にしていただければと思います。せっかくですので、フロアの方でですね、ご質問など、せっかく先生方、イギリスからいらっしゃっていただいておりますのでですね、ぜひ、どんなことでも結構です。専門のお話になくても結構ですので、講演をお聞きになって疑問に思われたこと、そんなことをぶつけていただきたいと思うんですけれども、いかがでしょう。そうですね。で、ぜひお願いします。ありがとうございます。
So in English, thank you very much indeed for two wonderful presentations transforming our views of medieval warfare. I have a short question for each of you, if that's okay. My question for Professor Friday is, does the archaeological evidence back up the historical sources in terms of understanding the proportions of different types of battle wounds that you were talking about? I'm aware of research in Europe where battle cemeteries have been analysed, and it's possible to tell how many people have been, how many times some of these warriors were struck by sharp or blunt implements. It's amazing how they survived, and you gave some examples of that. I'm very interested to hear about that from you. For Professor Adolphson, these monastic warriors, you started with an image of a romantic image of a medieval knight. And maybe from my ignorant background, I would say one of the things about a medieval knight was they felt they had God on their side. Is there anything comparable with this myth around the monastic warriors, that they also felt they had some kind of spiritual power on their side that maybe set them aside from more mundane warriors?
Okay. Archaeological evidence, that's an interesting problem. There's kind of two sides to this. I do need to put a disclaimer in here that which I probably should have thrown into the original talk, that my personal work is on the 14th century and earlier, so everything I'm talking about with regard to 15th and 16th century warfare is relying on secondary scholarship. For that latter period, though, there does seem to be very good archaeological evidence to back up what you're seeing in statistics. They've been doing some really interesting stuff. A lot of work looking at battlefields and things. Nagashino was a particularly famous one. In fact, it's become kind of a cottage industry in Japan. There are dozens of books saying Nagashino isn't what you think it is. One of my other co-authors, Tom Conlon, actually has been threatening for quite a while to do a book or an article saying that, even revised scholarship on Nagashino is not right. When you actually look at the battlefield. The earlier period is trickier. I don't really know very much work that's been done. In fact, part of the problem is that quite a few of these battlefields, we don't know where they are. I did a book on Taiwan Sakado, for example, and there are places that are identified as the site of such and such battle, but nobody actually knows. Sometimes there are 3 or 4 places that are identified as the famous site of this particular battle. There is one really famous piece of scholarship or pseudo-scholarship done on an excavation of collective tombs after the Battle of Kamakura, when they brought down the shogunate, that claims that what you're seeing, among other things, is a lot of sword wounds. It also claims to analyze skull shapes and determine that these warriors are obviously descendants of Ainu, rather than Japanese or Japanese, whatever. That's a pejorative term, I guess, to separate them, but I don't know what else to use. Which is very suspect in and of itself. And of course, the basic problem is we really don't know who's buried there. We don't know we don't know the circumstances of how those people were killed. They could be civilians who were rounded up after battles or whatever. So I don't really know that there doesn't seem to be a lot of archaeology to support the earlier stuff that I know of.
So I was very tempted to do some work on the medieval Templars, the Templar Knights, very famous warriors, medieval knights fighting for Christianity, Jerusalem and other places. But there's one major difference that makes the comparison not very valid, and that's that the Christian knights, of course, are fighting against another faith, and they are fighting against another, right? An other, so that is very clearly defined. And therefore, if you're looking at how the Templar Knights have been seen in European history, that's very positive in those cases, right? These were great warriors, they were fighting for their faith, they were sacrificing themselves for Christianity. There are cases where there was a kind of a crusade against southern France, which probably is not so popular, but so that's one difference. In Japan, there is no other, right? They're all Buddhist temples, and sometimes they fight each other, and that is, of course, part of where the negative reputation comes. However, there is, of course, an ideology behind this, and that's the Obo Buppo Soi. So the mutual dependence of the imperial and the Buddhist law, and because Buddhism was so ingrained in the imperial state, they were seen as part of the imperial state, and therefore, certainly when they were fighting, they were invited to fight in the Hogan Rebellion, right? Because they were part of it. So I think it's impossible to separate Buddhist temples out from society in general. So there is ideology behind it, but it would be very hard for Enraki monks to claim, for the Buddha, and then Kofuji monks come and say, for the Buddha. It's the same thing, right? So religious rhetoric, when it comes to monastic orders, is surprisingly absent. You won't find anyone saying that. You found a little bit in the 16th century with the Kaga province, Iki, right? When they do Shingon Buddhism, not Shingon, it's Jodo Shinshu, right? That is a little bit in there, but even that I think may have been exaggerated actually. So there is very little of it actually. Just very interesting.
もう一方、二方、どうぞ。
すみません、フライデー先生にご質問なんですけど、内刀は貧者のものだと考えられるっていうふうにおっしゃっていたんですけど、僕のちょっとした個人的な見解なんですけど、鎌倉時代、平安後期から鎌倉時代にかけての刀を室町時代に釣り上げてるんですね。そういった時に切っ先がすごい短くなるんですよ。それでそれを太刀としてではなくて内刀として再活用しているっていう例をよく見かけてて、 僕の友達が持っている小浦っていうものがありまして、それも室町時代に釣り上げられたものと考えられているんですけど、なんて言ったらいいんでしょう、ちょっとあれなんですけど、貧者の価値ではなくて、戦術が僕の中ではもう一回作る方向に戻ったのではないかっていうふうに考えているんですけど、いかがでしょうか。
まあそういう説はありましたね。似てるのが鎌倉後期とか南北朝の時代にはキューバの戦争から白兵戦になって、特に槍を中心して戦うようになったということですけど、やっぱりその何でしょう、スタティスティカル分析のごめんなさい、日本語が言えないではそのことはないみたいですね。特に槍になったというのは、槍が登場したのは13世紀末とか14世紀中でしたけど、盛んに使われたのは応仁戦乱以降でしたから、それもやはり政治的な違いで価値になったんです。刀もややまっすぐになったというのもあるかもしれないけど、それは多分作るのが楽だとか持つのが楽だとかということ、最終的にはやはり刀の作り方は弱いんですね。さっきの成瀬先生の研究を指したんですが、通貨が弱いしオイルとか、そういうもっと丈夫な統一的な刃と使う一緒だというような刀は日本の刀剣史の上では前にはあったし、まだ能力可能性はあるはずでした。だからもし突然にあるいはどんどん刀で剣で戦いたいというような理由があったら、どうしてもっと丈夫な剣が発展されなかったかというのは考えなきゃいけないと思います。だからそれは発展する必要がないというのは、これはどうせ使わないから、綺麗だし、これが便利だし、も気に入ってるから、もっといいのはどうせ危ないところ、弱いところで使わないということだと思います。
英語でします。I think one important reason why swords become more important, I may differ with Mr. Friday there, but the 16th century to me seems to be crucial. And the big change in the 16th century, it actually happens first, of course, the size of the armies. They get much bigger, and they have foot soldiers. Foot soldiers who do not use swords, right? They use weapons, or they use spears, or they use bow and arrow. Now, what happens to these people who were on horseback up until that point? They become either the elite troop, or they become the commanders. And it's not a coincidence that the sword martial arts schools appear in the 16th century, because that's a way for these commanders to set themselves apart from these lowly foot soldiers who, they don't have any skills. They just meet out there with a spear or something. Whereas the commanders, of course, they need to define themselves as being something else. And so I think the proliferation of martial arts schools teaching swords and the importance of the sword, I see that as happening in the 16th century because of the growing mass armies and the need for the commanders to say, we are the commanders because we have these skills. And that then carries over to the samurai in the Edo period. But that's my view, so I don't remember.
Yeah, because that's an interesting point. I've actually done some work on this for a different conference a few years ago. But one of the things that bothered me, I do some work with martial arts history as well, and one of the things that bothered me a lot as I was reading this revised scholarship on 16th century warfare was the fact that all of these martial arts schools that are appearing mainly in the 15th and 16th century tend to be so heavily centered on swords. And I wondered at first, is that not a counter-argument to what the mainstream military historians are discovering? But as I thought about that and started looking again more carefully at makimono and things from these early sword schools, it struck me, it's exactly the opposite. It's very similar to what Professor Adolphson is saying. I think that basically swordsmanship, martial arts schools, the sort of thesis on martial arts history is that these schools were invented as bujutsu, to train warriors for the battlefield, and then in the Edo period they become budo, about something else. In fact, of course, those terms are used interchangeably until the basically Taisho period. So the distinction is analytical; it's not historical. But also, I think that that's not true. If you look at the total number of schools that are around, you're talking about training 1 in maybe 10,000 people around the Japanese battlefield. So it certainly wasn't for training soldiers, and it wasn't even for training elite troops, because you have people like Miyamoto Musashi involved here, who are lowest of the low in terms of social background. So I think what's going on here is that these are, this Budo idea is what Yuha Buge was right from the very beginning. So that explains the prominence of swordsmanship. Swordsmanship is a sort of sine qua non, distillation of all other types of combat. And these Yuha were always intended not to train people for the battlefield, but to do something different, something that's more like what we now think of as Budo. And so swordsmanship is the example of all of this. It's like being in modern terms, you could be a Marine sniper, but you can also compete in the Olympic rifle shooting. And those are very different skills. There's overlap. In studying boxing and things, modern officers learn to box or to wrestle, or in Japan they play judo and such. Not because they, Akai is very big on this, the police are very big on it. Not because they expect to actually get out with swords or even shinai on the battlefield, but rather because it teaches you something about spirit and strategy and things like that. But I think that's always been part of this.
よろしいですか？ありがとうございます。
Hello, and it's actually a pleasure to see you both here today, because the book Japan Emerging piqued my interest in pre-modern Japan, so thank you very much. I'd like to ask a question, I guess, about the state of pre-modern study of Japan. And especially in England, it seems like a lot of students are becoming interested in Japanese studies because of modern Japan. That's not a bad thing, of course. And I sometimes find myself asking, what's the point of studying any pre-modern society? And I'd just like to have both of your opinions. What's the point?
One of my favorite questions, actually, having gone into it. Well, I hope I made a little bit of the case with the Sohei, because it is a very modern image, and if you don't care to actually study the pre-modern, you won't understand that image is misappropriated. I think it's just as important with the samurai, in fact, because, again, if you don't understand, for example, Nitoga's wonderful book, Bushido, the Soul of Japan, makes a very big claim in moving Bushido from a small section of society to every single Japanese, right? And so that's what we call a constructed tradition, right? The problem is you would never know that unless you actually study what came before. And I will be bold here because I don't think there are so many modern historians here. But I can guarantee you that pre-modern historians know modern history a lot better than modern historians know pre-modern history. And I think it's to their detriment that they actually don't study it more. I'm not saying that everybody should be a specialist, but I do think there is a very strong need for specialists, because I mean, every society has constructed images, invented traditions. It's not. But Japan, might argue, has a stronger presence of pre-modern Japan in the present, in part because of the warrior history, right? So if one were trying to understand Japan or get into Japanese culture, then even if you're modernist, not understanding pre-modern Japan, I think is a huge problem for most scholars. So, and just talking about England, you do know that Cambridge has a very vibrant postdoctoral program, right, postgraduate program right now with plenty of students coming in. So don't worry, we're there.
I hope to be there soon one day.
Well, we will welcome you.
Okay, yeah, I agree with Professor Adolphson. I think there are basically three arguments you can make. One is a sort of reductionist thing. It's probably the weakest. And if you want to understand post-war Japan, you need to understand pre-war Japan. To understand that, you've got to step back to Meiji Japan. If you want to understand Meiji, you need to understand the Tokugawa period. If you want to really understand the Tokugawa period, and you can step back. And there's something to that, but I guess, at some point you could say, how far back do I have to go if I want to know about Japan in the 1970s? Do I really have to go back to the Nara period? But more importantly, I think what Professor Adolphson was just talking about, the myth busting, is extremely important, and in part because people use history to make modern arguments, and to be able to say that, Tokyo is a perfectly good example. I've done quite a bit of small-time publishing on the idea of Bushido and where you're at this. And samurai were not like that. There's been both negative and positive views of Bushido and samurai. But in fact, Bushido is a modern concept. And Tokyo's version of it, the Imperial Army version of it, is very, very modern and very different from anything that anybody in the Tokugawa period would have considered, and extremely different from anything that anybody in the Sengoku, much less the Heian period, would have been thinking of. Another side to this, though, besides that sort of thing, is that I think that studying other things, other societies, the same reason that you study, why should an Englishman study Japan in the first place? Unless you want to make a career out of Japanese studies, what's the point of taking Professor Adolphson's class on medieval Japan? I'm going to be an engineer. What's that? I'm going to be an engineer. Why do I need to know that? Well, because it teaches you something about your own society too. That by looking at something else, you can get to what I think in terms of software and hardware. You can start looking at what's basically wired into us as human beings, the way you construct a society. And stepping back makes it even easier to do that. You get into much more difficult, much thornier political problems when you start talking about 19th century history or 18th century history or even 16th century history. The farther back you go, the easier it is to look at these kinds of things dispassionately and be thinking in terms of it. So I think you can learn a lot about human beings by studying.
Could I ask one more question? Do you think as historians we have some responsibility to make conscious connections between the past and the present? Or should we let those connections form themselves?
I am convinced that regardless of what history you study or publish on, it should be relevant. That doesn't mean that everything has to be justified in terms of, modern needs and stuff like that. But it needs to be relevant to people today as well. Having moved to England 3 years ago and having skipped most of my classes in medieval British history, I've now become completely enthralled by 12th century Britain with the famous chaos and the struggle behind, and even discovered, interestingly, England's greatest knight, William Marshall, who was born the same year as Minamoto no Yoritomo, was brought up as a hostage, and basically kept England together. Not very dissimilar from Yoritomo. So, there is always something that you can learn that I think, makes it relevant. But it has to be relevant. So the questions have to be relevant, the research has to be relevant, and it can be relevant in different ways. I would say 30 years ago, maybe, when you wrote, maybe you didn't have to make it relevant, but we're in a different environment. public universities are under pressure in different ways. It is, so you have to be a little strategic. But even before that, I always thought, it has to be relevant. It has to make some meaning of it.
Yeah, I would argue that I think it's further than that, actually. I think that history is almost by definition. That's the difference between history and antiquarianism. You can study old ideas just for the sake of knowing about something old, but historians don't tend to do that. One of the questions is that this is part of the stuff that comes out of the discussions for the course I used to teach on what is history. One of the questions that always comes up is, why does history change? My friends who are biochemists come back and say, well, history is just nonsense. You guys change your mind all the time. How can it? The past didn't change. Well, because history is not the past. It's a reconstruction. It's a rediscovery of the past. And why does history get rewritten? Because we ask different questions. And we ask different questions because we have different things that are interest us. 40 years ago, nobody cared about questions about gender, about questions about same-sex relationships. Who needs to know about that stuff? That's silly. What's important are elite men. Now we're saying, well, what happened to the other 98% of the Japanese population that they weren't court officials? That's important. It's harder to get at, but those are important questions. What is family? Why did men and women relate to one another in that way in the Heian period and differently in the medieval period? Because these are questions of contemporary interest. I've pointed out to students before that you look at the Heian period, you find a place that's a world that's dominated by special interests and party factions and private negotiations that mix up genuine public need with personal interests. Now, of course, that has absolutely no relevance to the way politics works today, right? And I think these are very interesting questions to bring up.
Thank you very much.
ありがとうございました。見学の方もね、ありますので、もう一方だけお願いします。手を挙げてますね。
すみません。フライデー先生にちょっとお聞きしたいんですが、社会的、文化的、政治的観点から考察して、いろいろいいお話を聞けたんですが、宗教的な観点も少し交えて、刀剣の位置づけっていうのをどう考えているのかをちょっと説明していただきたいんです。
はい。I think I'm going to try this one in English. I apologize. Certainly, religious ideas have an effect on the shape of warfare. I've talked about that before in print as well. I don't know that there's a direct connection to the weapons. That I wouldn't, off the top of my head, relate that directly to swords, for example. But it certainly has an effect on the way that the battles are fought and ideas about how they should be fought, ideas about how warriors are supposed to behave and that sort of thing.
So, because I was looking at temples for a long time and monastic warriors, I've very long looked for kind of more religious arguments within the kind of field of warfare and justifications. But I struggle a lot to find it in Japan. One of the more interesting things is that in the 12th century there's a definite shift because the imperial court, of course, is quite committed to its Buddhist temples. And they're very careful how they treat the Buddhist temples. And the example of the demonstrations, the goso, is very, very important there because they don't want to touch the mikoshi. If the mikoshi is damaged, the imperial court very readily will rebuild it. However, as soon as they bring in the Taira and the Minamoto and the warriors, they have absolutely no respect for the mikoshi. And they will shoot arrows at it, no time. And so there is, in fact, if anything, there is a move away, I think, from kind of religious considerations with the warrior class that don't seem to care, at least not about the Buddhist institutions. I think they may have a different relationship with Shinto institutions, but in terms of Buddhist ideology, they seem to be not caring too much. So that's an important shift, I think.
It's very interestingly to me that there's what Professor Adolphson was talking before about competing narratives. You see that very clearly when you're looking at Heian period sources in terms of warrior attitudes toward religion. On the one hand, clearly religion is everywhere on the battlefield. The idea that there are gods and spirits of various sorts that are out there on the battlefield with you and that affect battles is always there. On the other hand, I think the first thing that comes to my mind when you're talking about warrior personality is practical, pragmatic. They are never handicapped, for lack of a better word, by religious scruples in the way that Professor Adolphson is talking about temple. Don't shoot at the Mikoshi. That's a problem. We can't let these temples get away with this, so we're going to shoot at the Mikoshi. You see that quite frequently. There's a very famous scene in Mutsuwaki about the former 9 Years' War in the north, where they're getting ready to attack. The government army is getting ready to attack, and they have their religious advisors say, "Not today. It's the bad luck to attack. We have to hold off till tomorrow." And the commanders say, "Yep, makes sense." Now, of course, this is literature, right? It's an image, so we don't know how reliable that is, but it's still like. But then that turns right around because they've also got scouts out looking at the enemy position, and they bump into the enemy and start shooting at one another, and the commander says, "Oh wow, forget the auspicious importance and things. Start. Everybody else get in there and attack too." And this happens. And actually, right before that, the commander has supposedly done some ceremonies, and a dove comes flying over the army, which is a Hachiman symbol. And so they say, yes, so we've got divine backing for our. So clearly, on the one hand, warriors take this very, very seriously, and on the other hand, they don't let it get in the way of practical results, which is very interesting.
よろしいですか。はい、どうもありがとうございました。質問も尽きないんですけれども、この辺で、会を閉じる方向に行きたいと思います。フライデー先生、アドルフ先生、どうもありがとうございました。今井さん、拍手をお願いいたします。それでは、会を閉じるにあたりまして、センズベリー日本芸術研究所長、イーストアングリア大学教授のサイモン・ケラー先生にご挨拶賜りたいと思います。よろしくお願いいたします。
Thank you very much indeed, two very distinguished speakers for bringing us back to medieval times and demonstrating, I think, very clearly the significance that history can have, not only for understanding our own cultures, but for also encouraging much greater understanding between different cultures around the world. And I think that is what we have been trying to do in the last 5 years of these wonderful Ishibashi Foundation lecture series here in Japan. The Sainsbury Institute, as our chair of our management board, Professor Richardson mentioned, works on all different aspects of Japanese arts and cultures, from prehistoric times to the present. And we are delighted by the interest that our interest from outside Japan seems to generate inside Japan through these lectures. And we know that when we have speakers from Japan who come to the UK, when we do activities there, we are equally delighted by the levels of interest there are in the UK. And we're aware that these are levels of interest that are likely to be increasing in the future. Professor Adolphson mentioned the medieval chaos, the great chaos of the 12th century. from some perspectives, we seem to be in a contemporary period of chaos in the United Kingdom. But I think maybe we hope that through these kind of activities, we can put contemporary difficulties and problems in a longer term perspective as well as a broader international perspective as well. We have, to help us over this period of chaos, Prime Ministers May and Abe last autumn announced that there will be a UK-Japan season of culture stretching from the Rugby World Cup here in Japan in the autumn of 2019 through to the summer of 2020, when of course Tokyo will be hosting the Olympics and Paralympics. And we have, through at the Sainsbury Institute and at the University of Anglia, we have a series of activities through which we hope to be contributing to that season of culture. And I hope that many of you will be able to come and take part in some of those activities. I would just like to close by thanking once again our hosts here at Kokugakuin University. I have benefited personally very much over the years from the warm welcome, the tremendous hospitality of many colleagues who are in the room here today at Kokugakuin University, and thank you very much for making these wonderful facilities available to us. And also, I'd also like to extend my sincere thanks to the Ishibashi Foundation for their tremendous support, not only with my Sainsbury Institute hat on for these lecture series, but also for a summer school in Japanese arts and cultures, which the Ishibashi Foundation very generously sponsor at the moment, which we will be running for the next 2 years at least. And with that, I would like to invite the President of the Board of Directors of the Ishibashi Foundation, Mr. Ishibashi Hiroshi, who is here this afternoon, just to say a couple of words in closing.
ありがとうございました。では最後にですね、石橋理事長の方よりご挨拶を賜りたいと思います。よろしくお願いいたします。
皆さんこんにちは、石橋でございます。急にご指名をいただきましたので、何も一つお用意してなかったんですけれども、一言、お礼を申し上げたいと思います。私ども石橋財団というのは、この、レクチャーシリーズを5回にわたって実施することをお手伝いしてまいりました。先ほどからお話がありますように、欧米でいろいろ日本の文化について研究なさっている方がたくさんおられるんですけれども、その方々の研究の成果をなぜ日本で聞くことができないんだろうか、見ることができないんだろうかという簡単なその疑問から始まったことなんです。で、そういうことからたまたまお知り合いになりましたこの慶南先生と日本芸術研究所の皆さん方の力もありまして、このシリーズが始まりまして、またサマースクール、さっきちょっとありましたけど、これのお手伝いも始まったということでございます。ちょうど今回は5回目で、最初のクールといいましょうか、今年で終わるんですけれども、将来的にもですね、何か、これが新しい展開につながっていくことを大変期待しておりますので、またいろいろとご相談したいと思いますけれども、本当に今日は今日お話しいただきました、フライデー先生、それからアドルフソン先生、どうもありがとうございました。またイースタンミュー大学から見ました大学の基礎、リチャードソン学長、それからケンナ先生、それから渡辺先生もいらっしゃるのです。本当に今日はこのような、レクチャーが開催できましたのを大変嬉しく思っています。またこの場所をお貸しいただきました、国学院大学大学とも大変ありがとうございます。それからモデレーションいただきまして力どうもありがとうございました。本当にこれがまた何か新しい日本の文化を海外でイギリスでと私ども最初思ってたんですけど、あちらには大変各国からいろんな国からの方が 日本文化の研究者が見えてるということを聞きまして、たまたま今石川美大大学の方のお手伝いをしておりますけれども、意外とこの効果は世界に波及するんではないかというふうに、この皆様方のお仕事の広さというのを感心しております。ぜひこれからも発展してご活躍くださるといいと思います。私どもこれからよろしくお願いいたします。今日は本当にありがとうございました。
ありがとうございました。それでは、名残惜しいですけれども、会を閉じたいと思います。先ほど私が説明したですね、刀につきましては、6時まで博物館空いておりますので、ちょっと奥の方の候補のエリアに入っていただきますと分かるようにしてあります。それで、来年の1月なんですけれども、1月22日から、神に捧げた刀ということでですね、刀剣の展示、これは重要文化財の鶴岡八幡宮に奉納されております北条氏綱の奉納と、これはめったに見ることができませんので、そういったものから、ちょっと珍しいものをですね、多数出しておりますので、合わせてご協力いただければと思います。チラシの絵画ものですけども入れてあります。特典室ではですね、現在列島の祈りというですね、こういった大城祭にかけて、向かうですね、プロローグの展示をやっております。そして、特集展示では今、那智三景曼荼羅、これは研究いたしまして、その研究成果というものを開示しておりますので、合わせてご覧いただければと思います。それでは本当に今日はありがとうございました。